I had exactly $143.82 in my checking account, a healing incision under my right collarbone, and a yellow padded envelope sitting on my kitchen table with my dead father's initials written in black marker across the seal. 3 days earlier, while I was still sleeping upright in a recliner after heart surgery, my younger brother had emptied $418,000 from the family restoration company, transferred the title of our warehouse into an LLC I had never heard of, and scheduled a vote to remove me from the board at a charity gala built on my mother's name. I dropped one of my pain pills on the floor and had to get down on one knee to find it. That was the kind of week I was having. By the time I opened that envelope, I already knew two things. Someone inside my own family had planned this carefully, and if I missed one deadline, they were going to bury me with paperwork before I could stand up straight. Let me take you back. My name is Mara Ellison. I was 46 then, a licensed contractor in Savannah, Georgia, and the acting president of Ellison Restoration Group, the company my father built repairing historic homes, churches, and municipal buildings up and down the coast. My flaw, if I'm honest, was that I believed competence earned loyalty. It took me too long to learn that in family businesses, usefulness and safety are not the same thing. The deadline came to me in a voicemail from our outside counsel, a man named Gerald Pike, whose voice always sounded as if he were dictating from behind a polished mahogany desk. Mara, the emergency board meeting has been set for Thursday at 7 p.m. at the Hale Maritime Museum Gala. If you miss this, you lose everything. He did not say everything casually. He meant my voting shares, my office, my authority over payroll, and probably my father's reputation, which had more value in Savannah than any piece of real estate. The company bylaws allowed temporary proxy action during medical incapacity, but only if nobody challenged the designation within 72 hours. My brother Nolan had waited until I was discharged, groggy and slow, then moved. I played the voicemail twice, then opened the envelope. Inside was a flash drive, a copy of a deed transfer, and a sticky note in neat block letters. Check the metadata. Second folder. No signature. No explanation. Just that. Nolan had always been the golden child. He was 41, handsome in a soft, local magazine way, and very good at occupying rooms he had done nothing to build. He called himself vision-driven. What he meant was that he liked ribbon cuttings, donor dinners, and photographs where he stood one step in front of the people doing the work. Our father loved him in that helpless, forgiving way some fathers love sons who resemble their own younger mistakes. I had history with Nolan. Everyone in town knew the polished version, devoted family, second-generation business, preserving Southern heritage. The real version was quieter. When I was 17, I spent July on a church roof in Beaufort handing shingles to grown men in 100-degree heat because Dad said I needed to learn the trade from the bottom up. Nolan spent that same July networking at a youth leadership camp in North Carolina. Dad brought him back a framed certificate and brought me a pair of work gloves. Years later, when I won a city preservation bid that kept the company alive during a bad recession, Nolan stood next to me at the press conference and told a reporter, "Mara is great with details. I handle the relationships." He said it smiling. Calm cruelty wears good manners. The second incident came after Mom died. She had run the foundation arm of the business, giving grants to restore low-income seniors' homes. At the funeral reception, while I was refilling coffee for people who had loved her, Nolan leaned against the pantry doorway and said, "Try not to make this about work, Mara. People get uncomfortable when you look managerial during grief." That line stayed with me because it told me exactly how he saw me. Not daughter, not partner, useful machine. The flash drive contained exports from our shared drive, copies of closing documents, and a folder named Archive_7. Inside Archive_7 was a subfolder named Second. That second folder changed everything. It held draft versions of the warehouse deed, internal emails, and a PDF of our company bylaws with highlighted language around a fraud carve-out. That clause had been added after an embezzlement scare 15 years earlier. If a director used deception, forged authority, or concealed a related party transaction, any proxy vote connected to that act became void, and the company could seek an immediate injunction and asset freeze. At first, that was just theory. Then I checked the metadata. The deed transfer showed the warehouse sold for $10 to Harbor Lantern Holdings LLC. On paper, Harbor Lantern was managed by a registered agent in Delaware. But when I opened the document properties, the original author field was not the title company. It was Rodriguez Home. Nolan's wife's maiden name was Rodriguez. I kept going. There was also a board consent file author tagged by someone named Tessa Vale. Tessa was our new CFO, 6 months in, polished, efficient, and always careful to call me Mara, while calling Nolan Mr. Ellison in front of staff. I remembered that because it annoyed me more than it should have. The timestamps on the draft consents were 2 days earlier than the official minutes, which meant they had prepared the removal package before my doctor had even cleared me for discharge. I called the only lawyer I trusted with ugly family matters, Celia Wren, a probate and business litigator with a low voice and the kind of patience that makes dishonest people over-explain. She met me that afternoon in her office above Broughton Street, where every surface looked either antique or expensive enough to scare bad clients. She read in silence for 12 minutes. Then she said, "All right, let's separate insult from evidence." Celia explained the terms as we went because she knew I preferred plain English to theatrical Latin. A forensic audit, she said, was not just someone looking at the books. It was a traceable reconstruction of who moved what money, when, under what authority. An affidavit was a sworn statement we could put in front of a judge the same day, if needed. Metadata mattered because documents lie more often than their creation history does. The LLC mattered because related party transactions had to be disclosed under both our bylaws and state corporate rules. And the fraud carve-out was our opening. She tapped the highlighted page with one red nail. This isn't revenge. This is justice. I put the phone face down. Then I waited while she built the first strike. By Wednesday morning, the humiliation campaign had started. Nolan sent a company-wide email praising Tessa for stabilizing financial controls during Mara's health-related absence. He copied donors, project leads, and 3 museum trustees. He also reassigned my assistant to the gala planning committee and locked me out of the vendor payment portal. An hour later, Tessa called with that careful, smooth concern people use when they want witnesses for their own decency. "Mara," she said, "I know this must feel emotional, but your brother is trying to preserve continuity by draining the operating account." A pause. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "Then don't speak for it." She exhaled, soft and irritated. "The board will handle governance tomorrow night." There was the threat. Public, polished, irreversible if I let them control the room. By noon, Celia had filed for a temporary restraining order to prevent disposition of major company assets pending review. We were not granted the full order yet, but the judge gave us an emergency hearing for Friday morning if we could show immediate harm. That was enough to make Nolan nervous. People like him don't fear conflict. They fear records. The anonymous sender moved again that evening. A second envelope appeared in my mailbox, this one holding a valet ticket from the Hale Maritime Museum and a handwritten note. Ask why Tessa reserved the South Parlor audio booth. That was the social twist I had not seen coming. The gala was not just a board meeting. It was a performance. The museum's annual preservation fundraiser drew half the city's donor class, including a state senator, 2 bank board members, and the pastor of the church where my mother had been memorialized. If Nolan planned to remove me there, he wanted witnesses who mattered. Celia got us in through a friend on the museum board. The South Parlor audio booth was reserved for presentation support. We found a museum technician willing to talk after Celia mentioned subpoena power. He told us Tessa had requested a pre-recorded tribute reel and backup microphone routing for special remarks in case Ms. Ellison becomes distressed. I almost laughed. They had planned my breakdown as part of the evening's program. My flaw caused the next setback. Instead of staying quiet, I called Nolan. He answered on the second ring. "You sound stronger. Don't do this in public. Mara, you're not well. Everybody sees that." "I see the deed." Silence. Then a small chuckle. "You always were good at finding old paper. It's void. That depends who's reading." He hung up before I could say more, which was exactly what Celia later said he wanted. Confirmation that we had found something, without him admitting anything. I had tipped my hand. Not fatally, but enough to make him adjust. Thursday night, I walked into the gala in a black dress that still pressed uncomfortably against the surgical tape under my collarbone. Savannah in April smells like money and wet brick after sunset. The museum courtyard was full of linen jackets, quiet jazz, and people speaking in that warm civic tone that means they are measuring one another's usefulness. Nolan stood near the donor wall with Tessa and his fiancée, Laurel, who chaired the Junior Preservation Committee and had perfected the art of touching a man's arm as if she were blessing him for the room. When he saw me, he smiled without surprise. That told me he had expected I would come. He just believed I would come unprepared. "Mara," he said, kissing the air beside my cheek, "I'm glad you decided not to make this difficult." "I wore comfortable shoes," I said. "I planned to stand a while." There were two open loops in my head. Who had sent the envelopes, and what exactly they planned in the South Parlor audio booth. I did not wait long for either. During cocktails, an elderly man in a navy blazer stepped beside me and said, "Your mother hated cheap tricks." I turned. It was Reverend Paul Mercer, our family pastor for 30 years and one of the museum's quiet major donors. He handed me a folded program. Inside was a USB-C adapter. "I think you'll need this," he said. "And before you ask, no, I'm not your courier. But I know who was." He nodded across the room to a woman arranging name cards at the sponsor table. Evelyn Pike, Gerald Pike's wife, museum volunteer. Nolan had copied Gerald on half his transition emails because men like Nolan assume support staff, wives, and older women disappear into wallpaper. Evelyn had seen enough printouts on her husband's desk to understand something was crooked. She had also known my mother well enough to care. That was the ally identity twist, and it landed with more force than any dramatic reveal. Not because it was flashy, because it was plausible. At 7:15, guests were moved into the main hall. Nolan took the podium under a banner bearing my mother's name. He opened with preservation numbers, donor thanks, a brief tribute video, then shifted tone. "Strong organizations," he said, "adapt with grace during difficult seasons. Family businesses especially." The room softened for him. I could feel it. He introduced a governance proposal designed to protect Ellison Restoration Group while Mara focuses on recovery. Tessa stood at the side with folders for the board. The museum screens lit with a prepared slide deck showing declining cash reserves, project delays, and a line item labeled executive override risk. There it was, the humiliation threat. Not just removing me, but recasting me as unstable and obstructive. Nolan said, "Out of respect, we're offering my sister an honorary advisory role." Advisory, a decorative word, a dead one. Celia stood before I did. "Before any vote proceeds, we request disclosure of all related party transactions executed during Ms. Ellison's medical incapacity." It changed the air in the room by 2 degrees. "Enough." Nolan smiled. "Our council has reviewed all necessary disclosures. Then he won't mind this." Celia handed packets to the voting members and the museum chair. Inside were the deed, the author metadata screenshots, the draft board consents, and our affidavit from the title clerk confirming the warehouse transfer had been rushed without standard conflict review. Small reveal. People leaned down. Paper moved. Donors stopped pretending not to listen. Tessa stepped toward the audio booth, probably to cut the room's sound or shift to their prepared remarks. Instead, the screens flickered to a different input. Bigger reveal. The museum technician, prompted by the adapter and the USB Evelyn had slipped to me 10 minutes earlier, played an audio file recovered from the South Parlor backup system. Tessa's voice came through first. "If she gets emotional, keep the camera on Nolan." Then Nolan. "Once the vote is done, the bank covenant issue won't matter. Harbor Lantern holds the warehouse. We refinance through Laurel's uncle, and Mara can complain from home." Another voice I recognized only after a beat. Gerald Pike. "As long as the incapacity proxy stands, the rest is optics." The room did not gasp. Real power rooms rarely do. They go still. Nuclear reveal. Celia stepped forward and said clearly, "For those present who are board members or fiduciaries, you should understand what you just heard. An undisclosed related party transfer, coordinated during a director's medical incapacity, tied to a refinancing plan that would strip collateral from the operating company. Under the fraud carve-out in the bylaws, any proxy vote based on concealed conduct is void. We have already petitioned for emergency relief, including an asset freeze." Laurel's face drained first, then Nolan's. A bank director in the second row asked, "Did Harbor Lantern receive title before lender notification?" Tessa said nothing. The museum chair, who had known my mother for 20 years, stood and said, "This meeting is suspended pending legal review." Nolan tried for control. "This is family disagreement being weaponized in public." "No," I said, quietly. "This is public because you brought it here." He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time all night he seemed to understand I was not there to beg for dignity. I was there to document his choices. Friday morning, the courthouse smelled like floor wax and rain. Emergency hearings are short when the evidence is clean. Celia laid out the timeline, the deed, the metadata, the audio transcript, the bank risk, and the proxy abuse. She explained each term so the record was plain. The LLC was not illegal by itself. The concealment was the problem. The affidavit established probable deception. The forensic audit request was necessary because funds had moved through intercompany accounts without valid board approval. The temporary restraining order was needed to prevent more damage before the full case could be heard. Gerald Pike withdrew as counsel before the hearing started. That alone told the judge plenty. Nolan took the stand and tried the injured brother voice. Concern for my health, need for continuity, miscommunication, routine restructuring. He almost made it through. Then Celia introduced the canary clause. My father had inserted it into the bylaws after the old embezzlement scare. Any director initiating emergency governance action had to certify, under personal acknowledgement, that no undisclosed self-dealing existed. It was a canary clause because it was designed to catch exactly this kind of poison early. Nolan had signed that acknowledgement the same day the Harbor Lantern deed was drafted. Celia placed his signature next to the document timeline and asked, "Were you self-dealing when you signed this?" He hesitated 1 second too long. The courtroom went silent. The judge granted the temporary restraining order, froze the warehouse transfer, barred further asset movement outside ordinary payroll and vendor operations, and appointed an independent forensic accountant. He also suspended the proxy action pending a full governance review. Not final victory, but enough to stop the bleeding. Once the audit started, the rest came apart fast. Harbor Lantern was traced to a trust connected to Laurel's family lender. Tessa had routed consulting invoices through a side vendor to justify transition expenses. Gerald Pike's firm had billed for governance work while advising both the company and Nolan personally. The warehouse deed was voided within 3 weeks. Nolan was removed as interim chair by unanimous board vote, including 2 members he had counted on. Tessa resigned before termination and later settled civil claims without admitting liability, which is legal language for paying a lot to avoid a longer fight. Gerald lost 3 institutional clients in 6 months. That part was not my doing. Reputations have their own weather. As for the anonymous envelopes, Evelyn told me later she had nearly stayed out of it. She hated conflict, but she had seen my mother teach Sunday school in work boots after storm cleanups, and she said, "I couldn't bear watching polished people erase practical ones." That line stayed with me. There was no screaming ending. No triumphant public humiliation beyond what Nolan had built for himself. He moved to Charleston after the settlement and took a role in commercial development where, I'm told, he is supervised heavily. Laurel married someone else. The museum removed his family's donor plaque from that year's event. Quietly, I returned to work after the audit closed, not as a martyr and not as a saint, just as the person who knew where everything actually was. 1 year later, I was standing in the restored lobby of the Caro House, a 1908 brick home we had converted into transitional housing for seniors, the kind of project my mother would have loved. My scar had faded to a pale line. The company was smaller by design, better governed, and no longer dependent on one charming man's access to donor rooms. We had independent approval controls, cleaner escrow procedures, and a board that understood the difference between visibility and value. Reverend Mercer still sent us referrals. Evelyn joined the foundation committee and never once mentioned the envelopes again. My checking account was better too, though I still kept an embarrassing number of hardware store receipts in the console of my truck. People sometimes ask what the lesson was, usually because they want the satisfying version. Here it is: boundaries are not cruelty. Documentation is not disloyalty. And self-worth cannot depend on whether a family system benefits from your silence. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is refuse to be managed by people who mistake your steadiness for surrender. If you've ever been the competent one in a room full of polished excuses, You probably know that justice rarely arrives with music. It arrives as a filing stamp, a timestamp, a witness who finally speaks, and one clean sentence on the record that can't be walked back. So tell me, at what moment did you know Nolan had already lost? When the metadata surfaced, when the audio played at the gala, or when the judge read the clause he thought nobody would use? And if you want more stories where calm people win with evidence instead of noise, subscribe and stay with me.